research. So there's a lot of research that is happening in Canada. So we are in a good position, a leadership position, and there are many advantages to doing research in Canada. And there's also many organizations that are working at a provincial and national level to ensure that we can maintain and to grow our efforts in research. So what you see on the slide right now is a sampling of some of those initiatives that are working to improve the clinical research environment in Canada. And specifically, obviously, I'm going to talk today about the CCTCC. So the Canadian Clinical Trials Coordinating Centre was formed in 2014 in response to a 2012 Senate report on declining clinical research and clinical trials in Canada. And we're currently funded through a partnership between Innovative Medicines Canada, which represents the major brand name pharma companies, the CIHR, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and Healthcare Can, which is an organization that represents the research hospitals in Canada across the country. And as Mark said, one of our goal as an organization is to improve the operational environment for clinical trials in Canada, to promote Canada as a destination for clinical trials. So what I'll do in the next 15 or so minutes is to give you a bit of a context and to highlight some of the initiatives that we're working on right now. So our five key outcomes that we look at are facilitating collaboration across Canada, speeding up clinical trial startup times, promoting Canada. We look at funding provided to different organizations for collaboration, and finally, environmental pulse checks. So I'll just highlight each of these areas briefly. So facilitating collaboration across Canada, we do this through our working groups. So a lot of our projects are done through working groups by working with sponsors, with sites, with experts in the field. And specifically, we have our National Advisory Group, which advises us on our activities and our initiatives and what we should do. And we also brought together provincial clinical trial organizations looking to foster collaboration, to talk about best practices, to talk about how we can engage as a Canadian clinical trial field as opposed to individually. So we've brought together this group 3 times over the past 4 years, just to engage in that dialogue. The second area that we look at is speeding up clinical trial startup times. So in this area, we have a number of different initiatives. The first one that I'll just address briefly is the Canadian Clinical Trials Asset Map. So the CCTAM is a database which is designed to showcase Canada, our clinical research assets here. So investigators, sites, hospitals, CROs, even sponsors now are being added to the database. And it's the first pan-Canadian, pan-therapeutic, completely up to date. So we ensure that all of the assets in the map are up to date. And it gives a large, broad picture of what research is happening in Canada and where it's happening. Currently, we have 1,100 assets. We are actively working to grow that, and we know there's a lot of areas that we still need to expand into, but that is an active procedure. So it was launched 2 years ago, and since then has seen quite a considerable growth. So access to the database is free, and we're happy to talk about it and to share more if anybody is interested in that. By doing the asset map, we also worked with a number of different organizations across the country. For example, BC CRIN, which is now Clinical Trials BC. We have our database was modeled off something that they started, and so we have a partnership with them to move their data into our system, and we did a similar thing with Montreal in vivo. And the other aspect to the CCTAM that we're currently working actively on is the patient registries. So we're looking to populate them in the system, and not to host the patient information, but to ensure that the contact information is there. So if a sponsor or a site or CRO is looking to recruit for a study, they can go in and look and see the different patient registries. So that's something we're actively working on right now. The second major initiative that we have on the go at the moment is the Model Clinical Trial Agreement. So this is a Canada-wide initiative. It's been an initiative that has been in the works for many years. There's been many iterations of the contract, and we're very excited about where we are at this point. Last June, version 8 was released, and it was the result of more than 2 years of discussion and negotiation between sites and sponsors, and also a collaboration with CLEAR, which is the Common Language Evaluation and Reconciliation, which is a Transcelerate supported initiative. And Transcelerate is an American company with a number of pharma that are involved with it. So we wanted to ensure that that language, specifically on the contentious clauses, was in there, because a lot of the sponsors that come to Canada are American. So this gives them the context. And right now we're at the adoption and implementation stage of the initiative. So we're also looking to we're developing at the moment a review committee so that the contract can remain relevant. So there'll be sites and sponsors that are represented on that committee, and we are looking to collect feedback from those that are using the contract, and then in June the committee will meet, and we'll be looking towards the end of the summer to have a new version of the contract out. Stemming directly from the Model Clinical Trial Agreement was brought up the Fair Market Value Project. So again, if we're looking at reducing clinical trial startup times, one of the major contentious things tends to be the budget. So in Canada, our startup is competitive compared to Europe for cardiovascular studies, but not necessarily for oncology studies. And there's a lot of oncology studies. So part of it, as you can see from the contract timelines, there's the legal aspect, which is the contract negotiation, which we have touched on through the MCTA, but a large portion is that budget negotiation. So we've brought together the Fair Market Value Group a number of times, and we're discussing at the moment what that initiative is going to look like, how we're going to address it, and specifically, like, it's not necessarily setting prices for things, but ensuring there's an understanding between sites and sponsors. So the next section is promoting Canada as a leading destination for clinical trials. And we've done this through creating an investment case. So highlighting the speed, the quality of our trials here, and the different government incentives through tax breaks, but also the diversity that exists in Canada, and really the really big reasons for coming to Canada. So that is free to use. It's on our website. And I would encourage you to take a look at it. And it's definitely customizable, and we do ensure that that data is up to date. In terms of funding provided to different organizations, one of the organizations that we've worked very closely with is, as I mentioned, BC CRIN, which is now Clinical Trials BC. And they had done a clinical research participation survey. So anybody who had been invited to participate in a trial and either enrolled, declined, or did not meet the screening requirements was eligible to participate in this survey. And they went out starting in BC, and then when they looked to expand it across the country, we partnered with them and helped them translate it into French and to promote it. And so they reached their enrollment targets for the survey of over 1,000 in April, and now they're at the stage where they're analyzing the data. So I'm sure the slides will be available, so if you have questions about that, you can definitely contact Clinical Trials BC. And finally, the environmental pulse check. So there's two things that we touched on here. One is the Research Ethics Board report. So that report was released by our working group in 2016. There was a joint response prepared by the CCTCC and Health Canada that was released in January 2017, addressing their 7 recommendations, including the establishment of a national leadership committee looking at research ethics. And so we're in the process of kind of continuing to look at that. But one of the things they found when they did this report was that there was a lot of provincial initiatives that were happening, and a lot of harmonization was happening at that level. There's still a lot of work to be done, but it is happening more at a grassroots level and working its way up. And finally, the clinical trials metrics. So we wanted to know whether our work was having an impact, where Canada stands right now. And so we've sourced data from a number of different places, looking at quantitative metrics, operational metrics, and investment metrics. And we're also working with a number of organizations to get quality metrics direct from the sites. So that's in the process right now. So we're hoping by the fall that we'll have a report on where Canada stands right now. So that's everything I have to say. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions, or I'm happy to answer questions at the end as well.
Thanks, Kathryn. So with that kind of view on what I'll call the front end of the clinical trials process, not just process, but also oversight of clinical trials, and kind of a view on clinical trials before we get that kind of the final data deposit piece. Our second speaker is going to talk about the clinical trials context from the perspective of a particular institution. So Yunjo Lee is project manager in the Office of the Vice President Research at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. In her current role, she's responsible for the development, implementation, and management of institution-wide strategies and projects aimed at sourcing research funding and increasing the academic profile of the institution. She received a PhD and master's degree from York University and is currently completing her MBA at the University of Toronto. So we have two speakers, both enrolled currently in MBA programs, so that's great to see. That's a useful addition to the backgrounds for our speakers. So Yunjo, I'll pass it over to you, and again, feel free to put any questions or comments you may have in either the chat or the Q&A, and I'll get those ready for our speakers when Yunjo's done.
Thanks, Mark, for the introduction. So my presentation today has two parts. First, I will provide a brief overview of the issues around timely dissemination of clinical trial results. Secondly, I will describe the steps that our hospital has taken to address these issues, and also to ensure that clinical trial results are easily accessible and published. And throughout my presentation, dissemination of trial results, what results reporting means publication in a peer-reviewed journal, and or posting summary results to the clinical trial registry. So there is clear evidence that the results from many clinical trials are not shared. And a recent study by Chen looked at 51 academic medical centers in the US, and they identified all interventional clinical trials registered on clinicaltrials.gov with the primary completion date between October 2007 and September 2010, and with a lead investigator affiliated with an academic medical center. And clinicaltrials.gov is the largest registry in the world. And if you want to get FDA approval for your device or drugs, you must register your clinical trials in clinicaltrials.gov. And the figure shows the cumulative percentage of completed clinical trials with either published results or results reported on clinicaltrials.gov as of July 2014. So when they look at these studies, some of them were completed 7 years ago, and I think there's a little bit of error in the figure in the paper. So it looks like 70% disseminated the results, but actually the paper says 66% of the trials disseminated the results. However, only about 36% disseminated the results within 24 months of study completion. And you will see in the graph that the trial results are not disseminated within 4 years. Then they are never disseminated. And similar results were also found by Trials Tracker. And Trials Tracker is an online tool that tracks how many trials are updated with results on clinicaltrials.gov or published in peer-reviewed journals. And it was created to encourage and pressure scientists to publish the results of their clinical trials. And Trials Tracker reported that last year, they reported that 45% of clinical trial results worldwide were never reported to the clinicaltrials.gov registry or published in peer-reviewed journals. And it also gained media attention. For example, in Canada, it was picked up by CBC News. And another issue is that in Canada, there is no clear guidance. So for example, the Tri-Council Policy Statement, Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans, PCPS2, has an entire chapter devoted to clinical trials, but it does not provide any explicit guidance or time frame for trial reporting. So, so this paragraph is directly quoted from TCPS2, and you will see that it used quite vague language. So it encourages just asking researchers and institutions to make reasonable effort to disseminate the findings in a timely manner. However, timely dissemination of clinical trial results is very important because it allows the public to have access to ongoing clinical trials and basic study results. And it also reduces publication bias and duplication of research effort, because studies with statistically positive findings are more likely to have had results reported. And the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, ICMJE, requires trial registration as a condition of the publication. And it's not just ICMJE. In 2013, the World Medical Association explicitly stated that clinical trials must be registered and have their study results reported. And in 2015, World Health Organization, WHO, emphasized again the importance of registering and reporting trial results. And Section 801 of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Amendment Act, FDA 801, requires responsible parties to register and submit summary results of clinical trials with clinicaltrials.gov. And this law applies to certain clinical trials, which is applicable clinical trials of drugs, including biological products and medical devices. So in the next slide, I'm going to explain this FDA rule a bit more. So there has been very important changes in the requirements of the FDA and the NIH related to the registration and reporting of clinical trials. So effective January 18th, 2017, the FDA 801 mandated that all applicable clinical trials be registered on clinicaltrials.gov and have results reported on clinicaltrials.gov no later than 12 months after the last patient has been followed up for the primary outcome. And applicable clinical trials are interventional studies of FDA-regulated investigation on new drugs or biological products. So it excludes phase 1 trials and small phase 0 small feasibility trials, and also it excludes any behavioral intervention studies. However, NIH applies the rule to all NIH-funded interventional studies, whether it is partially or fully funded, and also they apply the rule to phase 1, phase 0 feasibility studies, as well as interventional behavioral intervention studies. And posting summary results in the clinicaltrials.gov is in a tabular format, so it's not very extensive. And you just need to report participant flow, baseline characteristics such as demographics and study-specific measures, and outcome measures and basic statistical analysis results, as well as adverse events. And if you do not, so there may be consequences for non-compliance to the responsible party, which is often a sponsoring institution. And these consequences could include hefty fines, which is actually $10,000 per day, and or suspension of grant funding from NIH to the institution. So St. Michael's Hospital was one of the organizations actually notified by Trials Tracker that a majority of our clinical trials listed on clinicaltrials.gov have not been published. So Trial Tracker, just as a reminder, Trials Tracker identifies or interventional trials completed between January 2006 and December 2014. And it excluded phase 0 and 1 trials and those that have made a formal request to delay results. And then Trial Tracker's algorithm checks if the trial results are posted on clinicaltrials.gov, and also it checks the PubMed for publication. And we review the list of unpublished trials provided by Trials Tracker for our institution. And we also individually followed up with our principal investigators about the status of their trial. And we also manually searched NCTID, which is clinicaltrials.gov registry number, in PubMed to verify publication. So out of 43 eligible trials, so we had about 43 eligible trials between that period specified by Trials Tracker, and we haven't published results for 31 trials. According to Trials Tracker, we haven't published results for 31 trials, which is 72%. And out of these 43 eligible trials, 12 trials identified by Trials Tracker as published reported NCTID in the publication abstract, but actually none of the trials reported its results to clinicaltrials.gov. And out of 31 trials reported by Trials Tracker as not published, 16 trials were actually published in peer-reviewed journals, but they did not report NCTID in the abstract, but mostly in the method section or not at all. And 4 trials were in press or under review or revision, and 4 trials were being written for publication, and 7 trials were not published at all. And for those 7 trials that were not published at all, reasons are it's because of early termination due to enrollment problems or high dropout rates, or the researcher thought was enough to present it at conferences. But we didn't hear from one principal investigator at all, despite we contacted the group multiple times. So we were actually relieved because 74% of clinical trials were published or being published. However, it wasn't satisfactory because it should be 100%. So we have taken some immediate steps to ensure that our clinical trial results are easily accessible and or published. So we developed institutional guidelines mandating trial registration, timely updates, and summary results reporting. And currently, we are implementing a system to monitor compliance and follow up with investigators who do not follow the guidelines. So I will explain each of these in more details. So these guidelines have been effective on September 1st, 2017. And our guidelines mandates that or interventional trials. So these guidelines apply to investigator-initiated or interventional trials where St. Michael's is registered as the sponsor, or the lead principal investigator is at St. Michael's and hold the funds through St. Michael's. And our guidelines mandates that first, or interventional trials be registered on one of the registries that are accepted by ICMJE and WHO. And secondly, a trial record is updated in a timely manner as required by the registry. For example, clinicaltrials.gov has very specific deadlines for trial record updates for whenever there's a change in recruitment or a completion date or protocol. And thirdly, we require that the guideline requires that principal investigators post summary results to the respective registry. So in case of applicable clinical trials, ACT, the results must be posted within 1 year of the primary completion date. This is just required by FDA. And for any clinical trials funded wholly or partially by NIH, this rule applies for both ACT and non-ACT trials, including behavioral interventions. And the results must be posted within 1 year of the primary completion date. This is required by NIH. And any interventional studies that are not ACT and are not funded by the NIH, and we still, even though these are not required by FDA or NIH, we require our researchers to submit the results to clinicaltrials.gov or the other registries that their trial is registered within 2 years of the primary completion date. So we are establishing this requirement because we believe it is important that all trials are analyzed and reported in a timely manner. But we are actually giving our investigators 1 more year than the FDA or NIH. Then we also engage our research community. So we created an information guide and FAQ documents to explain what are the acceptable registries and what are the recent changes in the US FDA and NIH rules and what are the definitions of applicable clinical trials. And if you go to our website, you can see the info guide. And we also clearly communicated to our researchers that summary results posted in clinicaltrials.gov will not impact on the ability to publish on peer-reviewed journals because it's a very brief summary of their results. And we also advise our researchers to work with the editor to ensure that their NCT ID appears in the abstract. We also have a clinical trial coordination center called Applied Health Research Center. And while we are developing our guidelines, we were in close contact with the center as well as our research ethics board to find ways to assist our researchers and also to increase their compliance. For any trials coordinated by the Applied Health Research Center, the center has agreed to submit summary results to clinicaltrials.gov following our guidelines. And for trials that are not coordinated by the center, they also have agreed to answer any questions from any of our researchers, or they can even submit the results on behalf of the researcher for a small fee. So since our guideline became effective, the clinical trial registration is required by our REB approval, and summary results reporting to the registry is also required for the REB closure. And currently, our hospital is developing a new web-based application system called Capture, which allows researchers to obtain already approvals to conduct human subject research. And this system, it was actually developed by University Health Network UHN, and we are working with them to adapt their system to our institution. And the system consolidates and replaces all paper forms, and it ensures that the study is reviewed by all the department and committees that are providing approval. So once this system is fully implemented, trial registration and summary results reporting will be more systematically tracked through this system in the future. So in summary, timely dissemination of trial results is important for the complete and unbiased reporting of all research results. Particularly, it is really important for those trials that are not publishable. And Trials Tracker provides a useful tool for audit despite its limitations. The data provided by Trials Tracker were not quite accurate, but however, it really triggered us to conduct our internal audit and respond to the problem. And we also know that our Canadian institutions, particularly the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, they also have actively conducted an internal audit and contacted individual researchers whose trial results were not made public. So, and we would like to know what other institutions are doing, so please contact me. And also for any questions if you have. And for, although we do not post our internal policy document to the public on the internet, but all other information that we created to help our researchers to follow our guidelines are posted in our website. So you can check it through the link in my presentation slide. Thanks.
Thanks, Yunjo. So both speakers are done now. So if people do have questions, and I actually have a few myself here, but I'm tracking the chat and Q&A. I don't see any questions yet from attendees, so would encourage anybody who does have a question to type them out into the chat or Q&A window. So while we're waiting to see if anybody does have any questions, maybe I'll just ask a few myself if I could. Kathryn, one for you. I was curious, you talked about the role of the center in facilitating using Canada as a location for clinical trials. And I wondered, listening to Yunjo as she talked about the reporting of clinical trials, does that factor, that of let's call it the compliance framework within the Canadian context, have any impact on whether or not clinical trials are done in Canada? And I'm going to maybe rephrase it somewhat provocatively by saying, if our compliance is lower than in other jurisdictions, does that dissuade or encourage research organizations, for example, from the US in carrying out clinical trials here? Does that make any sense, Kathryn?
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of compliance because there isn't necessarily a standard, compliance with reporting is definitely encouraged. And I mean, we've seen from the reports that have come out that there tends to be a bit of a public backlash when they find out that there isn't reporting that's being done or results aren't being shared. And so there is definitely an advantage to ensuring that we are compliant and we are sharing results of studies, both good and bad results or results that are unexpected, because it shows the quality of research that's being done in Canada, and it shows that we are investing in our researchers and that good research is happening. And so that is definitely an advantage that we can use to promote to the sponsors. in terms of whether it brings more trials to Canada, not necessarily, but it would increase the awareness of trials and our ability to do trials here, if that makes sense.
Sure. Thanks, Kathryn. And maybe, in a sense, a bit of a follow-up on the thread from that and some of other comments for both you, Kathryn, and Yunjo. I've always been fascinated by this area in terms of the lack of reporting, whether it's pre-reports or the reporting clinical trials once they're done. So I'm curious about why mandates like the NIH one that Yunjo highlighted was brought out in January of 2017 that requires deposit and has apparently some potentially even financial impacts for non-compliance. Why, given the impact on health research and the fact that this is often involving human or always involving human subjects, why is it not more important or more common, for example, in a jurisdiction like Canada, to require reporting of clinical trials? And I'll let you both respond to that.
So I will respond first. It's probably because a lot of clinical trials led by Canadian institutions are just subcontract of FDA investigational like drug trials. So they, like, even in St. Mike's, most of our trials are not considered as applicable clinical trials. So directly, most of our trials are not directly under FDA rule. So I think probably that's why. And even for NIH grant, we hold in our institution, most of our NIH grants are subcontracts. So there is less pressure on our Canadian researchers.
Kathryn, did you want to say anything on that point, or?
In terms of compliance, I would say that there is, I think one thing that researchers have often had to be very careful about in the past is by publishing the results, like what is the impact and how are people going to understand that? So I think the more that becomes important, the more compliance is going to become important. That's what I would say about that.
Okay, thanks. And Yunjo, you indicated that your internal kind of policy documents or framework isn't available on the website. I wonder if there's an opportunity, given St. Michael's leadership in this area and others, as you mentioned, like the Ottawa Hospital, if there's an opportunity to kind of turn some of that into what I would call boilerplate template type document that is not St. Michael's specific, but provides other institutions with the opportunity to kind of, I'm going to say copy and paste, but base their own internal clinical trials policy and documents on something that you've already done. Is that feasible, do you think, or something?
Yes. So if any institution is interested in getting a copy of our internal policy, we are happy to share it. We are not just posting it on on the internet for the public, but we do share it if we get contacted by other institutions. Okay,
great. Still no questions, but as is my way, I have one or two more here. But just to remind people that if you do have questions for our two co-presenters, to type them into the chat or Q&A window. And I just have two questions that are related more to the kind of the final outputs and tracking impacts of things like clinical trials and this kind of research. And one is, Yunjo, I know you mentioned that one of the efforts that you undertook after your internal investigation was to encourage or ensure that the NCTID appears in the abstract. of clinical trials. And to me, that somewhat mirrors the challenge that we have in what I'll call the research ecosystem of not having things like the CIHR funding application or the CIHR funding ID, or those kind of unique numbers that make it possible to link outputs like the specifics of a funding for research to the subsequent outputs based on that. So can you say a little more about the effort that you undertook to encourage PIs to carry out that simple act of including the NCT ID, and why that seems to be a challenge? Is it just a cultural, historic thing, or any comments on that?
I think a lot of researchers were not aware that NCT ID should appear in the publication abstract. And it's also we also contacted several journal editors to ask whether they requires NCT ID or put NCT ID in the publication abstract, and some yes, but some don't. So it's not just our researchers' lack of knowledge, but even some of the journal editors were not aware of it, which is an issue. So education of the broad research community would be important.
Yeah, and that's I think it's increasingly it's a key interest of Research Data Canada, is facilitating a better adoption of best practices, which includes adding things like persistent IDs for data sets or other things, or research-specific numbers, whether it be an NCT ID or a grant number and those kinds of things, because it does facilitate a richer ecosystem of metadata and linking all these different outputs. And then my final question for either one of you, and Yunjo, again, you mentioned the CAPCR database and the project where you're kind of using that as the opportunity to facilitate some of this work, including the deposit of the trials. Has there been any discussion of your researchers having ORCID IDs, and whether or not there's an opportunity to push some of this content from a system like CAPCR out to an individual researcher's ORCID record? And similarly, Kathryn, is our ORCID ID something that comes to the attention of the center and the work you do there?
Actually, that's really great idea. We've been educating our researchers to have ORCID ID, but we don't actually know how many our researchers have ORCID ID. But it would be a good thing to include it in our online application system as well. Yeah,
anything on that one, Kathryn? I know it's probably less critical in the front end as the process, but did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we don't, because we focus more on kind of overall operational efficiencies. We don't necessarily touch individual clinical trials, and so it wouldn't necessarily come across our desks, so to speak, very often, but it is something that's kind of on the radar.
Yeah, and it just occurs to me that it's a great, in that kind of front-end process where you're facilitating not just the use of the Canadian context for clinical trials, but also the adoption of best practices within that clinical trials community. That might be a good place in which to socialize the importance of ORCIDs for individual researchers, and just to kind of bring that message full cycle in the ecosystem.
For sure. I know there's organizations that we work with, like N2, that are working in, which is network of networks, that
right.
are working in more directly with clinical researchers, and I'm fairly sure that they would touch on that more than we do, and they definitely do best practices from a clinical research perspective and across institutions as well.
Yeah, and I noticed you had NAFRO highlighted in a couple of your slides as the national organization that represents provincial, initially health funding agencies, but increasingly provincial research funding agencies as these organizations get broader remits for more than just health research. So it's nice to see that NAFRO is a partner with the center.
Yeah, for sure.
So I guess you've both done, aside from my my questions, you've both done such a great job that I don't see any questions in either the chat or Q&A. So given the time that people have had to put those questions in, I'm going to assume that there are none. And I'll just wrap up by, first of all, thanking Yunjo and Kathryn for presenting today, and again, giving us a nice high-level and I think complete picture of the nature of clinical trials and from the start to reporting the outputs of this research. So thank you both for that. And I would also again highlight that we will have the archive of the today's session available shortly, and we'll send that out to everybody who's registered. And Yunjo or Kathryn, I just offer each of you any final word or comments before we end the session.
I would just say thank you for the opportunity to share the work that we're doing, and if anybody has questions later or wants to follow up, then they're definitely welcome to contact me.
Yes, me too. Thanks for the opportunity to share our institution's practices, and I would be happy to chat or talk to anyone who has any questions.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you both. With that, I will end the webinar and thank both our panelists and our attendees, and enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you very much.